The rain fell heavily, pounding against the windows of the limousine as it glided through the deserted streets of New York. The sleek black vehicle cut through the night fog like a shadow among shadows, heading toward a destination known to very few. Inside the car, Victor Harrington, a middle-aged man with an intimidating presence, stared out at the storm, his sharp eyes reflecting the lightning streaking across the sky. Victor was a billionaire known more for his reclusiveness than his wealth. His fortune was vast, his influence undeniable, yet his face was seldom seen in public. Only those in his inner circle knew where he lived. A sprawling mansion hidden within a vast estate, surrounded by dense forests and ancient secrets. Victor carried an air of mystery, a darkness that seemed to deepen with each passing year, ever since the tragedy that had haunted him for nearly a decade. As the car moved closer to the estate, Victor's mind drifted back, lost in memories he fought to bury. The image of his wife, Elizabeth, and their daughter, Emily, smiling at him that fateful day, still burned in his memory. They had been everything to him, and losing them had left deep scars. He had never allowed anyone to get close to him again. The world saw only the reserved billionaire, but behind the doors of his mansion, he was a haunted man, surrounded by the ghosts of his past. But on this stormy night, something would change. Something, or someone, was about to enter his life uninvited. Lena Thompson ran desperately through the rain-soaked streets, her footsteps lost in the downpour. Her heart raced, and with every corner she turned, she glanced over her shoulder, fearing the silhouette of the man who hunted her. She was exhausted, but she couldn't stop. Her baby's life depended on it. 8 months pregnant, Lena was fleeing a nightmare. She had spent the past few weeks on the run, moving from city to city, trying to escape the man who wanted her dead. She knew she couldn't trust anyone, not after everything she had uncovered. But now, her strength was waning, and despair was creeping in. She needed to find shelter, somewhere safe where she could finally rest and perhaps find a way to save herself and her child. When she saw the imposing gates of Victor Harrington's estate, a faint hope flickered in her chest. Maybe here, in this secluded place, she could finally find refuge. Without hesitation, she crossed the muddy road and forced her way through the open gate, running toward the mansion that loomed dark and majestic before her. Inside the house, Victor was alerted by security that someone had breached the property. He frowned, surprised. It was rare for anyone to approach his domain. Intrigued and slightly irritated by the intrusion, he ordered that the person be brought to him. When Lena was led into the grand hall, drenched and trembling with fear, her eyes locked with Victor's. Both remained silent, the world around them seeming to fade for a moment. Victor, with his commanding presence, observed the woman before him, trying to discern what had brought her to his doorstep. There was something about her, something beyond the obvious fear, that unsettled him. Lena, breathless but resolute, knew she couldn't afford to lose this chance. "Please," she pleaded, her voice weak but determined. "I need your help. He's trying to kill me." Her words echoed through the hall, and something in her tone made Victor pause. He didn't know who she was or what had driven her to seek him out, but he sensed that this night would mark the beginning of something much larger than either of them could imagine. Victor studied the woman standing before him, soaked to the bone and visibly trembling. Her eyes, wide with fear, held a desperate plea that struck a chord deep within him. The storm outside continued to rage, thunder rumbling in the distance, but inside the grand hall, there was only the tense silence between them. "Who is trying to kill you?" Victor asked, his voice calm but edged with a hint of curiosity. He had encountered all manner of people over the years, but this young woman, pregnant and alone, seemed an enigma. Lena swallowed hard, her throat dry despite the rain. "I don't know his real name," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But he's been following me for weeks. I found out things I wasn't supposed to, things about people who are dangerous. Now he won't stop until I'm dead, until we're both dead." Victor's gaze briefly shifted to her swollen belly, then back to her pale face. There was a flicker of something in his expression, recognition, perhaps, or a memory that resurfaced momentarily before he pushed it away. "And you came here," he said, more a statement than a question. Lena nodded, her hands instinctively moving to cradle her stomach. "I didn't know where else to go. No one would believe me, and everyone I've tried to trust has turned against me. But I heard about you, Mr. Harrington. They say you're a man who understands what it's like to lose everything." Victor's expression hardened slightly at her words. The mention of his own loss, still a raw wound even after all these years, touched a nerve. He turned away from her, walking slowly to the large windows that overlooked the storm-lashed grounds. He stood there in silence, his back to Lena, as he considered her situation. For years, he had isolated himself from the world, building walls, both literal and emotional, to keep others out. He had no desire to involve himself in the affairs of others, especially those that might bring danger to his doorstep. But something about Lena's plight, about the fear in her voice and the life she carried within her, stirred something within him that he had thought long dead. After a long pause, Victor spoke, his voice low and measured. "You can stay here for now. My staff will prepare a room for you, and we'll discuss your situation in more detail tomorrow. But understand this," he turned to face her, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "I don't get involved in other people's problems. Once you've rested and we've assessed the situation, you'll need to figure out your next move." Lena nodded, relief washing over her, though she could tell from his tone that Victor was a man who kept his distance, even when offering help. "Thank you," she said quietly, knowing she had no other options left. Victor gestured to one of his staff members, who had been standing discreetly at the edge of the room. "Show her to a guest room," he instructed, "and make sure she has everything she needs." As Lena was led away, Victor returned his attention to the storm outside. The mansion, usually a place of solitude and silence, now felt different with this unexpected guest. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of trouble she had brought with her, and whether his decision to let her in would be one he would regret. In the dim light of her newly assigned room, Lena sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle over her. The mansion was a fortress, a place that felt both safe and forbidding. She knew she couldn't stay here forever, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, she thought, this was the beginning of the end of her nightmare. Meanwhile, Victor remained in his study, the fire crackling in the hearth as he poured himself a drink. His thoughts drifted to the past, to the life he had once known before tragedy had shattered it. He wondered if he had made the right choice by allowing Lena into his home. The ghosts of his past whispered their doubts, reminding him of what he had lost and what he had vowed never to risk again. But despite his reservations, something told him that Lena's arrival was no mere coincidence. She had crossed the threshold of his sanctuary, and with her, she had brought the echoes of a danger that Victor could not yet fully understand. The night wore on, the storm outside beginning to subside, but inside the mansion, a new storm was brewing, a storm of secrets, fears, and buried truths that would soon come to light. The next morning, sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick curtains of the mansion, casting a dim, muted glow over the rooms. Lena awoke with a start, disoriented at first by her unfamiliar surroundings. It took her a moment to remember where she was and why. The events of the previous night came rushing back. Her desperate flight through the rain, the imposing figure of Victor Harrington, and his reluctant offer of refuge. Sitting up slowly, Lena felt the weight of exhaustion in her bones. She hadn't had a decent night's sleep in weeks, always on the move, always looking over her shoulder. But here, in this quiet, hidden place, she had slept deeply, if only for a few hours. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to hope that she might be safe, at least for a little while. She rose from the bed and approached the window, parting the heavy drapes just enough to peer outside. The storm had passed, leaving the grounds glistening with morning dew. The vast estate was surrounded by thick woods, a natural barrier that shielded the mansion from the outside world. Lena couldn't help but feel a sense of isolation, as though she had stepped into a different reality, far removed from the dangers that still loomed just beyond the trees. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called out, her voice still hoarse from sleep. A young woman entered, dressed in the crisp uniform of the household staff. She smiled politely, though there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "Good morning, Miss Thompson. Mr. Harrington has asked me to bring you breakfast. He also mentioned that he would like to speak with you in his study when you're ready." "Thank you," Lena replied, trying to mask the nervousness she felt at the thought of facing Victor again. She watched as the maid set down a tray of food: toast, eggs, fresh fruit, and a pot of tea on a small table near the window. "If you need anything else, please don't hesitate to ask," the maid added before quietly leaving the room. Lena sat down at the table, her gaze lingering on the food in front of her. She hadn't eaten properly in days, and her body craved nourishment, but her nerves made it difficult to focus on the meal. She forced herself to take a few bites, knowing she would need her strength for whatever conversation awaited her with Victor. After finishing what she could, Lena took a deep breath and made her way to the study. The mansion was vast, its hallways lined with dark wood paneling and old, elegant portraits. It was a place that exuded wealth and power, but also a palpable sense of loneliness. She wondered how long Victor had lived here, alone with his memories. When she reached the study, the door was ajar. She hesitated for a moment before gently pushing it open. Victor was seated behind a large mahogany desk, his attention focused on a document in front of him. The room was dimly lit, with heavy curtains drawn against the morning light, and the walls were lined with shelves full of books and old artifacts. "Mr. Harrington," Lena began, stepping into the room. Victor looked up, his expression unreadable. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Lena obeyed, feeling the weight of his gaze as she settled into the chair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Victor seemed to be studying her, assessing her with the same cold, analytical approach he used in business. Finally, he broke the silence. "You said last night that someone is trying to kill you. I want to know exactly what you've gotten yourself into and why you thought coming here would help." Lena clasped her hands in her lap, trying to steady her nerves. She knew this was her chance to explain, to convince Victor that she wasn't just some troublemaker bringing chaos to his doorstep. "It started a few months ago," she began, her voice steadying as she recounted the events that had led her to his mansion. "I was working as a researcher for a law firm. Nothing glamorous, just digging up information for cases. But one day, I stumbled across something unexpected. I found documents linking the firm to illegal activities, money laundering, fraud, connections to organized crime. I didn't realize the significance at first, but when I tried to dig deeper, strange things started happening. My computer was hacked, I received anonymous threats, and then people I knew started disappearing." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly as he listened, but he remained silent, letting her continue. "I went to the police, but they brushed me off, said I was overreacting. I tried to warn my boss, but that's when I realized he was in on it. They all were. That's when I knew I had to run." Lena paused, taking a deep breath. "I've been on the run ever since. They've sent someone after me, a man who won't stop until I'm dead. I've barely escaped him twice. I don't know who else to trust." Victor leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "And what made you think you could trust me?" he asked, his voice calm but probing. Lena hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I didn't know if I could," she admitted finally. "But I've heard about you, Mr. Harrington, about how you lost your family, how you've shut yourself off from the world. I thought maybe you would understand what it's like to have everything taken from you." Victor's expression remained impassive, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or anger. "What you've gotten yourself involved in is dangerous, Miss Thompson. More dangerous than you probably realize. If what you're saying is true, you've put yourself, and possibly everyone around you, in grave danger." Lena's heart sank. She knew he was right. "I didn't mean to drag you into this," she said quietly. I didn't have anywhere else to go." Victor was silent for a long moment, weighing his options. He had spent years building walls around himself, refusing to let anyone breach the fortress he had created out of grief and guilt. But now, this woman had stumbled into his life, bringing with her a storm that threatened to tear down those walls. Finally, he spoke. "You can stay here for now," he said, his voice firm. "But understand this. I'm not your savior, Miss Thompson. I'll help you as much as I can, but at the end of the day, you'll have to face this on your own." Lena nodded, her relief tempered by the gravity of his words. She knew this was far from over. But for now, she had a place to stay, a momentary reprieve from the nightmare that had consumed her life. As she left the study, Victor watched her go, his thoughts troubled. He had allowed her into his home, but he knew the danger she carried with her was far from over. The past he had tried so hard to bury was inching closer, and with it, the possibility that he might be forced to confront the very things he had spent years avoiding. And so, as the day wore on, both Victor and Lena found themselves standing on the edge of a precipice, aware that the shadows they had tried to escape were gathering once more, ready to pull them into the darkness. Days passed in a tense rhythm within the walls of Victor Harrington's mansion. Lena, though grateful for the shelter, couldn't shake the unease that settled in her chest. The mansion was a sanctuary, but it was also a prison, isolating her from the outside world and the danger that still lurked beyond the gates. Victor kept his distance. His presence felt more as a shadow that lingered in the corners of the mansion than as a comforting figure. He rarely spoke to Lena, leaving her in the care of his staff. Yet, every now and then, she would catch a glimpse of him in the hallways, his expression unreadable, as if he were both watching over her and keeping her at arm's length. One afternoon, as Lena wandered through the mansion, she found herself drawn to a room she hadn't yet explored. The door was slightly ajar, and as she pushed it open, she was met with the sight of an elegant library, the walls lined with shelves overflowing with books. A large window at the far end of the room allowed soft sunlight to spill in, casting a warm glow over the rows of leather-bound volumes. Lena hesitated at the threshold, feeling like an intruder, but the library beckoned to her, offering a momentary escape from the weight of her troubles. She stepped inside, running her fingers along the spines of the books, feeling a sense of calm wash over her for the first time in days. As she explored the library, her attention was caught by a small photograph sitting on a side table. She picked it up, her breath catching in her throat as she recognized the figures in the picture. It was a family portrait: Victor, a beautiful woman with kind eyes, and a young girl with a bright smile. Lena realized she was holding a glimpse of the life Victor had lost, the life that had driven him into solitude. She was so engrossed in the photo that she didn't notice Victor entering the room. "That was taken a year before they died," he said quietly, his voice startling Lena. She quickly set the photo back down, feeling a flush of embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," she began, but Victor waved her apology away. "It's fine," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. He moved past her and sat in one of the armchairs by the window, his gaze distant. "Elizabeth and Emily. They were my world." Lena felt the weight of his words, the depth of his loss hanging in the air between them. "What happened to them?" she asked gently, though she feared the answer. Victor was silent for a long moment, his eyes locked on the photograph. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, tinged with a pain that time had not dulled. "They were killed in a car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit them head-on. I was supposed to be with them that night, but I had a business meeting that ran late. By the time I got to the hospital, it was too late." Lena's heart ached for him. She could see how the loss had shaped him, turning him into the isolated man he was today. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice filled with genuine sympathy. Victor looked at her, his expression softening slightly. "I've spent years trying to move on, but some wounds never heal. I thought that by shutting myself away, I could keep the pain at bay, but all I've done is build a prison around myself." Lena nodded, understanding all too well the feeling of being trapped by circumstances beyond one's control. "I can't pretend to know what you've been through," she said, "but I do know what it's like to live in fear, to feel like there's no way out." Victor's gaze sharpened, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "What is it you're really running from, Lena?" he asked, his tone probing but not unkind. Lena hesitated, unsure if she was ready to reveal the full extent of her fears. But something about Victor's presence, his own vulnerability laid bare, encouraged her to open up. "I'm not just running from the man who's after me," she admitted. "I'm running from the choices I've made, from the mistakes that led me here. I thought I was doing the right thing, trying to expose the corruption I found, but now, I'm not so sure. Maybe I've just made things worse." Victor listened intently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "You can't change the past, Lena, but you can decide how you're going to face what's coming. Hiding here won't solve anything. Eventually, you'll have to confront whatever it is you're running from." Lena knew he was right. The longer she stayed hidden, the more power her enemies would gain over her. But the thought of facing them alone terrified her. "I don't know if I can do it," she confessed, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Victor rose from his chair and walked over to the window, looking out at the vast, secluded grounds. "You're stronger than you think," he said, his voice firm. "But strength alone won't be enough. You need a plan, and you need to be smart about it." Lena stood silently for a moment, absorbing his words. She had been so focused on survival that she hadn't allowed herself to think beyond the next day, the next hour. But Victor was right. If she wanted to truly be free of the terror that haunted her, she would need to face it head-on. Finally, she spoke. "Will you help me?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Victor turned to face her, his expression unreadable once more. "I'll help you as much as I can," he said, after a long pause. "But understand this, Lena, I have my own demons to face. I can't promise that I'll be there every step of the way." Lena nodded, accepting his terms. It was more than she had hoped for, and she knew that whatever lay ahead, she would have to face it with courage she wasn't sure she possessed. As Victor left the room, leaving her alone in the quiet library, Lena felt the weight of what was to come settling over her. She had found an unexpected ally in Victor Harrington, but the road ahead was still fraught with danger and uncertainty. The shadows that surrounded them both were growing darker, and Lena knew that soon she would have to confront the forces that had driven her into hiding. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel completely alone. The days blended together in a slow, uneasy rhythm as Lena adjusted to life in Victor's mansion. The initial shock of her arrival had worn off, replaced by a growing tension that gnawed at her whenever she was alone with her thoughts. The estate, with its sprawling grounds and dense woods, was both a refuge and a reminder of how isolated she had become. But beneath the surface of this apparent tranquility, Lena sensed that something was stirring, something deeper and more unsettling than the immediate threat to her life. Victor, true to his word, had begun helping her devise a plan to deal with the danger she faced. Their conversations were intense and often strained, as Lena found herself drawn deeper into the complex web of fear and uncertainty that had entangled her life. But as they spent more time together, she couldn't shake the feeling that Victor was hiding something that connected them in ways she didn't yet understand. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows crept through the mansion, Lena found herself alone in the vast living room. The room was filled with heavy, antique furniture and dimly lit by the glow of a single lamp. The weight of the day's discussions with Victor hung over her, leaving her restless and uneasy. She needed to clear her mind, to make sense of the thoughts swirling in her head. She decided to explore the mansion further, hoping that a walk through the silent halls might bring her some clarity. As she wandered through the corridors, her footsteps echoing softly against the polished floors, she came across a staircase that she hadn't noticed before. It led downward into what appeared to be the basement. Curiosity tugged at her, and without thinking twice, Lena began to descend the stairs. The air grew cooler as she went deeper, and a faint musty smell filled her nostrils. At the bottom, she found herself in a narrow hallway with several closed doors. The atmosphere was different here, heavier, more oppressive, as if the mansion's secrets had sunk deep into the walls. Lena approached one of the doors, hesitating before placing her hand on the knob. She knew she was venturing into a part of the house that was likely off-limits, but something compelled her to continue. Slowly, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was dimly lit by a single overhead light, casting long shadows across the floor. It was filled with old furniture, covered in white sheets, and stacks of boxes lined the walls. But what caught Lena's attention was the large wooden chest in the center of the room. It was intricately carved, its surface covered in dust, as though it hadn't been touched in years. Lena approached the chest, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what she might find inside, but the pull of discovery was too strong to resist. With trembling hands, she lifted the heavy lid, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, she found an assortment of items: old photographs, letters, and small trinkets. Carefully, she picked up a photograph, her eyes widening as she recognized Victor, much younger, standing beside the same woman and child from the photo in the library. But these photos were different. In them, Victor looked happier, more at ease. The woman, Elizabeth, was smiling warmly at the camera, and the little girl, Emily, was laughing, her eyes full of life. Lena continued to sift through the contents of the chest, her fingers brushing against a stack of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. She hesitated, feeling a pang of guilt at the thought of invading Victor's privacy, but something urged her to keep going. She untied the ribbon and opened one of the letters. The handwriting was elegant, but the words were filled with sorrow and regret. They were letters from Elizabeth to Victor, written in the months before her death. As Lena read, she realized that Elizabeth had known something was wrong, that she had been worried about their safety, that she had felt a growing sense of dread. The last letter in the stack was the most troubling. In it, Elizabeth mentioned a name, someone she feared, someone who had been watching them. "I'm afraid, Victor," she had written. "There's something I haven't told you. There's someone who's been following me, watching us. I don't know who they are, but I'm scared. Please, we need to talk about this. I can't shake the feeling that something terrible is going to happen." Lena's heart raced as she read the words. This was more than just a tragic accident. There was a connection between what had happened to Victor's family and the danger she was facing now. She quickly folded the letters and placed them back in the chest, her mind reeling with the implications. Before she could process everything, she heard the creak of a floorboard behind her. Lena spun around, her breath catching in her throat. Victor stood in the doorway, his expression dark and unreadable. "What are you doing down here?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with tension. Lena swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. "I was just exploring. I didn't mean to intrude. I just found this chest and—" Victor's eyes flicked to the open chest, then back to Lena. "You found things that were meant to stay buried," he said quietly, stepping into the room. "Things that I've tried to forget." Lena bit her lip, unsure of how to respond. "Victor, I'm sorry, but these letters, what Elizabeth wrote, it sounds like she was afraid of someone." Victor's jaw tightened, and he looked away, as if the memories were too painful to face. "Elizabeth was worried, yes, but she never told me the full extent of it. After they died, I found those letters, and by then it was too late. I spent years trying to find out who she was talking about, but I never could. Eventually, I gave up, convinced that it was just her anxiety. But what if it wasn't?" Lena pressed, her voice filled with urgency. "What if there's a connection between what happened to your family and what's happening to me now? The same people who were after her could be the ones coming after me." Victor's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Lena saw a flicker of fear in them. "I don't know, Lena," he admitted, his voice strained. "But if you're right, then we're both in more danger than we realized." A heavy silence fell between them as they absorbed the gravity of the situation. Lena knew that she had stumbled upon something far bigger than she had anticipated, something that tied her fate to Victor's in ways she couldn't yet fully understand. Victor closed the chest and slowly replaced the lid, as if sealing away the memories once more. "We need to be careful," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If what you're saying is true, then we can't afford to make any mistakes." Lena nodded, her resolve hardening. The mystery surrounding Elizabeth's death, the danger she herself was facing, it was all connected. And now, more than ever, she needed to uncover the truth, not just for her own survival, but for Victor's as well. As they left the basement, Lena felt a chill run down her spine. The shadows in the mansion seemed darker now, as if the walls themselves were closing in. But she couldn't back down. There was too much at stake. Together, she and Victor would have to confront the secrets buried in the past, before those same secrets destroyed them both. The discovery of Elizabeth's letters weighed heavily on both Victor and Lena in the days that followed. The mansion, once a place of quiet refuge, now felt ominous, as if the very walls were whispering secrets they could no longer ignore. The connection between Elizabeth's fears and the danger Lena faced seemed undeniable, yet the pieces of the puzzle were still frustratingly out of reach. Victor became more withdrawn, spending hours alone in his study, poring over old files and documents, searching for anything he might have missed. Lena, too, felt the strain of the new revelations. Her sleep was plagued by nightmares, fragments of memories twisted into visions of dread, and she woke each morning with a sense of impending doom. One evening, unable to bear the solitude any longer, Lena sought out Victor in his study. She found him seated at his desk, surrounded by papers and books, his face etched with the lines of exhaustion. The fire in the hearth cast a warm glow over the room, but there was no comfort in it. Only the flickering shadows that danced across Victor's troubled expression. "Victor," Lena began, her voice soft but insistent, "we need to talk. We can't keep going like this, isolated in our own thoughts. If we're going to figure out what's really going on, we need to work together." Victor looked up from the papers, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of weariness and resolve. "You're right," he admitted, pushing the documents aside. "I've been trying to make sense of everything, but the more I dig, the more questions I find. There's something we're missing, something that ties it all together, but I can't see it." Lena sat down across from him, her mind racing as she considered their options. "What if we're looking in the wrong place?" she suggested. "Maybe the answer isn't in these documents or in the past. Maybe it's in the present. Whoever's after me now might be the key to understanding what happened to Elizabeth." Victor frowned, considering her words. "You think they're connected?" he asked, though the possibility had already begun to take root in his mind. Lena nodded. "I do. It's too much of a coincidence. Elizabeth was afraid of someone who might have been watching her, and now that same someone, or at least someone connected to them, is after me. We need to figure out who they are and what they want." Victor leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "If you're right, then we need more information. We need to know who's pulling the strings behind the scenes, and we need to do it quickly before they make their next move." Lena felt a surge of determination. "Then we need to set a trap," she said, her voice steady. "We need to draw them out, make them think they've won, and then find out who they really are." Victor raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the idea. "And how do you propose we do that?" "We could use me as bait," Lena suggested, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess them. "They've been chasing me for weeks. If I make it seem like I'm vulnerable, like I'm about to give up, they might make their move." Victor's expression darkened, a hint of anger flickering in his eyes. "That's too dangerous, Lena. We don't know what they're capable of. I'm not going to put you in harm's way like that." But Lena shook her head, resolute. "I'm already in harm's way, Victor. Hiding here isn't going to make it go away. We have to take control of the situation, or we'll always be one step behind." Victor stared at her for a long moment, his jaw clenched as he wrestled with the decision. Finally, he sighed, nodding in reluctant agreement. "All right," he said, his voice firm, "but we do this on my terms. We'll set up the trap, but we'll do it in a way that minimizes the risk to you. I'll be watching every step of the way." Lena felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. She knew the plan was risky, but it was the only way to force their enemies into the open. "What do we do first?" she asked, eager to move forward. Victor leaned forward, his mind already working through the details. "First, we'll need to make it look like you're about to leave the mansion. They need to believe you're alone and vulnerable. I'll have my security team create a false trail, something that will draw them to a specific location." Lena nodded, listening intently. And then we wait," Victor said grimly. "When they make their move, we'll be ready." "But Lena," he added, his tone serious, "you have to be prepared for anything. These people are dangerous, and they won't hesitate to hurt you if they think it'll get them what they want." Lena swallowed hard, the reality of what they were planning settling over her like a heavy weight. "I understand," she said quietly, "but I can't keep running forever. If this is the only way to end it, then I'm willing to take the risk." Victor studied her for a moment, his gaze softening slightly. "You're brave, Lena," he said, his voice low. "Braver than you realize. But you don't have to do this alone. I'm with you, every step of the way." Lena felt a surge of gratitude, and for the first time since arriving at the mansion, she allowed herself to believe that they might have a chance. "Thank you," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Victor didn't respond, but there was a silent understanding between them, a shared determination to see this through, no matter the cost. Over the next few days, they put their plan into motion. Victor's security team carefully laid the groundwork, planting false information and setting up a network of surveillance to monitor any signs of movement from their enemies. Lena prepared herself mentally for what was to come, knowing that the next step would bring her face to face with the people who had turned her life into a living nightmare. As the day of the trap approached, the tension in the mansion grew palpable. Victor and Lena spoke little, their minds focused on the task at hand. Every detail had to be perfect, every contingency accounted for. There could be no mistakes. Finally, the day arrived. Lena, dressed in simple clothes and carrying a small bag, stood at the front door of the mansion, ready to step into the unknown. Victor watched her from the shadows, his expression unreadable. He had given her a small earpiece, hidden beneath her hair, that would allow them to stay in constant communication. "Remember," Victor's voice crackled softly in her ear. "I'm right here. If anything goes wrong, we abort the plan immediately." Lena nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm ready," she replied, though the fear gnawed at her insides. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the mansion, walking down the long driveway toward the main road. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the estate. Everything was quiet, too quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. As Lena reached the gate, she paused, glancing back at the mansion one last time. She could feel Victor's presence, even if she couldn't see him. It gave her strength, knowing that she wasn't truly alone in this. She turned and continued walking, following the path that had been carefully set out for her. The trap was laid, and now all they could do was wait and hope that the shadows they were luring into the light wouldn't consume them both. Lena walked steadily down the narrow path leading away from the mansion, each step carrying her deeper into the trap she and Victor had set. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in deep hues of purple and blue, and the woods surrounding the estate grew darker with each passing minute. She could feel the tension in the air, a suffocating presence that made her hyper-aware of every sound, every rustle in the leaves. The plan was simple: make the enemy believe she was alone and vulnerable, an easy target. Victor's security team had carefully orchestrated everything to ensure the illusion was convincing. They had even left small signs along the path, a discarded map, a forgotten scarf, designed to make it look as though Lena had left the mansion in haste, desperate and afraid. But despite their careful planning, Lena couldn't shake the fear that gnawed at her. She was the bait in this deadly game, and if anything went wrong, there would be no second chances. Her mind raced with thoughts of what might happen, but she forced herself to focus on the task at hand. Victor was watching, and she had to trust that he would step in if things took a turn for the worse. She continued down the path until she reached a small clearing surrounded by trees. This was the designated spot, the place where she was supposed to wait. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood there, the silence of the forest pressing in around her. She strained to hear anything, a footstep, a whisper, but there was only the sound of her own breathing. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Lena's nerves were stretched thin, her senses on high alert. She clutched the small bag she carried, knowing it contained nothing of value, but designed to look like it did. It was part of the ruse, a decoy to draw out the enemy. Finally, she heard it, a faint rustle in the bushes behind her. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned slowly, her eyes scanning the darkness. There was nothing at first, just shadows and the outline of trees. But then, a figure emerged from the gloom, moving silently toward her. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the man approaching. It was him, the man who had been chasing her for weeks, the one who had haunted her nightmares. He was tall, with a lean, muscular build, dressed in dark clothes that blended seamlessly with the night. His face was partially obscured by a hood, but she could see the cold, predatory glint in his eyes. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze locking onto hers. "You shouldn't have run," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You've made things much worse for yourself." Lena forced herself to stand her ground, even as fear threatened to overwhelm her. "I'm not running anymore," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "It ends here." The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. "Brave words," he said, a hint of amusement in his tone. "But you're alone, and you're out of options. Hand over what you stole, and maybe I'll make this quick." Lena's mind raced. She knew she had to keep him talking, to buy time for Victor to act. "I didn't steal anything," she said, her voice firm. "I discovered the truth. That's why you're after me, isn't it? Because I know what you and your people are really up to." The man's expression darkened, and he took a step closer. "You don't know anything," he snapped, his voice sharp. "You're just a nuisance, a loose end that needs to be tied up." Lena's heart pounded as she saw him reach for something in his jacket, likely a weapon. Panic surged through her, but she fought to keep her composure. "If I'm such a nuisance, why not just kill me and be done with it?" she challenged, hoping to keep him talking. The man paused, his hand hovering over his jacket. "Because my employer wants to make sure you suffer first," he said with a cold smile. "He's not one for loose ends, and he certainly doesn't like being exposed. You've made this personal." Lena felt a chill run down her spine. Whoever was behind this, they were powerful, ruthless, and willing to go to any lengths to protect their secrets. But she also realized something crucial. The man in front of her wasn't the mastermind. He was just a hired hand, following orders. Before she could respond, there was a sudden rustling sound behind the man. He stiffened, turning slightly to glance over his shoulder. In that moment, Lena's pulse quickened. This was it. Victor's team was moving in. But then everything happened at once. The man spun around, pulling a gun from his jacket in one swift motion. Lena's breath caught as she realized the danger was escalating far faster than she had anticipated. She could hear Victor's voice crackling in her earpiece, urgent and commanding. "Lena, get down now!" Without thinking, Lena dropped to the ground just as a shot rang out, the sound echoing through the trees. She covered her head, her heart racing as she heard the scuffle of footsteps, the shouts of Victor's men as they closed in on the attacker. The next few moments were a blur. Lena lay motionless on the ground, her ears ringing from the gunfire, her body trembling with adrenaline. She could hear the sounds of a struggle, grunts, the thud of bodies hitting the ground, but she didn't dare look up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Lena lifted her head cautiously, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She saw Victor's security team surrounding the man, who was now lying on the ground, restrained and disarmed. Victor himself stepped forward, his face grim as he surveyed the scene. "Are you all right?" Victor asked, his voice tight with concern as he crouched down beside Lena. She nodded, still shaken but unhurt. "I'm okay," she managed to say, though her voice was unsteady. "Did we get him?" Victor glanced at the man, who was glaring up at them with a mixture of anger and defeat. "We did," he confirmed, "but this isn't over yet. We need to find out who sent him." Lena slowly got to her feet, her legs trembling slightly. She watched as Victor's men hauled the attacker to his feet, securing his hands behind his back. The man said nothing, his expression a mask of defiance. Victor turned to one of his men, his tone commanding. "Take him back to the mansion. We'll question him there, and make sure he's secured, no mistakes." As the security team began to escort the man away, Victor placed a reassuring hand on Lena's shoulder. "You did well," he said, his voice softening. "But we need to move quickly. We've bought ourselves some time, but whoever's behind this won't stop until they get what they want." Lena nodded, her fear now mixed with determination. They had taken a significant step in uncovering the truth, but the danger was far from over. As they made their way back to the mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were only beginning to unravel a much larger conspiracy, one that would demand everything they had to survive. As they reached the mansion, The air was thick with tension. Victor led Lena to a secure room where she could rest and recover from the ordeal. But rest was the last thing on her mind. The encounter in the woods had only fueled her resolve to see this through to the end. Victor watched her carefully, noting the fire in her eyes. "We'll get answers," he promised, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "No matter what it takes." Lena met his gaze, nodding in agreement. The trap had been sprung, but the real battle was just beginning. The shadows that had haunted them for so long were finally coming to light, and there was no turning back. Back at the mansion, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Victor's men had secured the attacker in a locked room, and now the questions that had been simmering for weeks demanded answers. Lena stood outside the door to the makeshift interrogation room, her heart pounding as she tried to steel herself for what was to come. Victor emerged from the room, his face set in a hard expression. "He's not talking," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "But we don't have time to wait for him to change his mind. We need to know who sent him and what they're planning." Lena nodded, understanding the urgency. The man they had captured was dangerous, but he was just a piece of a much larger puzzle. Whoever had sent him wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted, and that meant time was running out. "I'll talk to him," Lena said, surprising even herself with the firmness in her voice. Victor looked at her, a mix of concern and curiosity in his eyes. "Lena, this isn't your responsibility. We have professionals who can handle this." She shook her head. "He came after me. He's been following me, trying to kill me. Maybe he'll say something to me that he wouldn't to anyone else." Victor hesitated, clearly torn, but he could see the determination in Lena's eyes, and after a moment, he nodded. "All right," he agreed reluctantly, "but I'll be right outside. The moment I think you're in danger, I'm pulling you out." Lena took a deep breath and nodded, trying to steady her nerves. "I understand." Victor opened the door for her, and she stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, with a single chair in the center where the attacker sat, his hands bound behind him. His eyes narrowed as he saw Lena enter, but he said nothing, his expression cold and unreadable. Lena crossed the room slowly, keeping her distance as she regarded the man who had haunted her for weeks. She could feel the tension radiating from him, a coiled spring ready to snap. But she couldn't afford to show fear, not now. "Why are you after me?" Lena asked, her voice steady. The man sneered, his lip curling in disdain. "You think you're important?" he spat. "You're just a loose end that needs tying up. You stumbled onto something you shouldn't have, and now you're paying the price." Lena forced herself to remain calm, even as his words sent a chill down her spine. "What is it I stumbled onto?" she pressed. "Who sent you?" The man's expression remained defiant. "You're not going to make it out of this alive," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You're just another casualty, and no one will remember you when this is over." Lena felt a surge of anger, but she kept her voice level. "You're wrong," she said quietly. "I'm not the only one you're up against. And the people I'm working with, they're not going to stop until they bring down whoever's behind this." For a moment, the man's eyes flickered with something. Doubt, perhaps, or fear, but it was quickly masked by his usual bravado. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said, leaning forward as far as his restraints would allow. "You're playing a game with people who have nothing to lose. You're already dead. You just don't know it yet." Lena felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach, but she refused to back down. "If that's true," she said, "then why haven't you killed me yet? Why all the games? If you wanted me dead, you could have done it a long time ago." The man hesitated, and Lena saw the opening she needed. "You're not here just to kill me," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "You're here to find something, aren't you? Something that's more valuable to your boss than my life." He didn't respond, but the flicker of unease in his eyes told her she was on the right track. "What is it?" Lena pressed, stepping closer. "What do you want? What are you looking for?" The man's jaw clenched, his silence a testament to his resolve. But Lena wasn't about to give up. "You can either tell me," she said, her voice cold, "or you can wait for Victor to come back in here. And I guarantee you, he won't be as patient as I am." There was a long, tense pause. The man's eyes darted to the door, as if calculating his chances of escape, but he quickly realized there was no way out. Finally, with a low growl, he spoke. "You don't know what you're up against," he muttered. "It's not just about you, it's about what you found. There's a list, names of people who were supposed to stay hidden. Powerful people, dangerous people. Your little investigation uncovered more than you realized, and now they want to make sure you don't expose them." Lena's heart raced as the pieces began to fall into place. "A list?" she repeated, her mind racing. "Where is it?" The man glared at her, his expression twisted with anger. "If I knew that, you'd already be dead," he snapped. "But someone else does, and they'll find it soon enough. And when they do, you're finished." Lena's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about silencing her. It was about finding something that could bring down powerful people, people who would stop at nothing to protect themselves. She turned to leave, her mind spinning with the implications of what she had just learned. But before she could reach the door, the man called out to her, his voice filled with a dark satisfaction. "You can run all you want," he said, "but it won't matter. They'll find you, and when they do, you'll wish you'd never been born." Lena didn't respond. She stepped out of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. Victor was waiting for her, his eyes filled with concern. "What did he say?" Victor asked, his voice urgent. Lena took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "He's looking for a list," she said. "Names of powerful people, people who would do anything to stay hidden. My investigation must have uncovered something, and now they're trying to find it before I do." Victor's expression hardened. "We need to find that list before they do," he said, his voice filled with determination. "If it's as important as he says, it could be the key to bringing them down." Lena nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The stakes were higher than she had ever imagined, but now they had a lead, a way to fight back against the shadows that had been closing in on them. Together, they began to plan their next move. The enemy was still out there, and the danger was greater than ever. But for the first time, Lena felt that they had a chance. A slim one, perhaps, but a chance nonetheless. As the night wore on, the mansion remained shrouded in darkness, but within its walls, a new resolve took hold. The battle was far from over, but now, armed with the knowledge of what their enemies were after, Lena and Victor prepared to take the fight to them. The mansion was quiet, but beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. The revelation of the list had set everything into motion, and now there was no turning back. Lena and Victor knew that their enemies were closing in, driven by desperation to retrieve the list that could expose them. Time was running out, and every second brought them closer to a final confrontation. Victor spent hours poring over the information they had gathered, trying to piece together the identities of the people on the list. He was methodical, his mind sharp despite the exhaustion that weighed on him. Lena watched him work, feeling a mixture of admiration and fear. She knew how much was riding on their success. If they failed, it wouldn't just be their lives at stake, but the lives of countless others. As the hours passed, a plan began to take shape. It was risky, and it required them to take the fight directly to their enemies. But it was the only way to ensure that the list wouldn't fall into the wrong hands. Victor called in favors, mobilizing resources that had been dormant for years. He was preparing for war, and Lena could see the determination in his eyes. This was no longer just about survival. It was about justice, about making sure that the people who had destroyed so many lives were finally held accountable. "We need to move quickly," Victor said, his voice firm as he laid out the details of the plan. "If we can get to the location before they do, we have a chance of finding the list and securing it. But once we're there, we'll be on their turf. We'll be outnumbered, and they'll stop at nothing to protect themselves." Lena listened intently, absorbing every detail. "What if they get there first?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Victor's gaze hardened. "Then we'll have to improvise. But we can't let them take that list, Lena. If they do, it's over." Lena nodded, her resolve strengthening. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "Whatever happens, we can't let them win." Victor looked at her, a rare glimmer of approval in his eyes. "You've come a long way," he said quietly. "When you first came here, you were running. Now you're ready to fight." Lena felt a surge of determination. She had been through hell over the past few weeks, but it had changed her, made her stronger. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled her. "I'm not running anymore," she replied. Not from them, and not from the truth. Victor gave a curt nod, satisfied. Good. We leave at dawn. Get some rest. You'll need it. Lena knew she wouldn't be able to sleep, but she agreed, knowing that any moment of rest she could grab would be crucial. She returned to her room, her mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. The mansion felt different now. No longer a place of refuge, but a staging ground for the battle ahead. As she lay on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, Lena couldn't help but think about the journey that had brought her here. She had been thrust into a world of shadows and secrets, forced to confront dangers she never could have imagined. But through it all, she had found an unexpected ally in Victor Harrington, a man who had once been as lost as she was, but who had now become her partner in this fight for justice. When dawn broke, the mansion was already buzzing with activity. Victor's security team moved with precision, preparing for the mission ahead. Lena joined them, dressed in dark clothes, her hair pulled back, ready to face whatever awaited them. Victor handed her a small earpiece, just like the one she had worn during the trap. We'll stay in constant contact, he said. If anything goes wrong, you need to let me know immediately. Lena nodded, slipping the earpiece into place. I understand. They left the mansion in silence, a convoy of dark vehicles moving swiftly through the early morning mist. The destination was a remote location outside the city, a place where Victor believed the list might be hidden based on the information they had pieced together. It was risky, going on the offensive like this, but they had no choice. The clock was ticking, and their enemies wouldn't wait for them to make the first move. The drive was tense, the silence in the car thick with anticipation. Victor sat beside Lena, his expression unreadable, his mind clearly focused on the task ahead. Lena stared out the window, watching the city fade into the distance as they moved closer to their destination. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, a mixture of fear and excitement that kept her on edge. Finally, they arrived. The location was an old, abandoned factory, its crumbling walls and rusted gates a testament to years of neglect. Victor's team quickly spread out, securing the perimeter and preparing for what was likely to be a fierce confrontation. Victor turned to Lena, his voice low and steady. Stay close to me. We don't know what we're walking into, but we need to be ready for anything. Lena nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the moment. Their lives and the lives of countless others depended on what they did next. As they approached the entrance to the factory, Lena's senses went into overdrive. Every sound, every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat. They moved inside, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. The factory was a labyrinth of old machinery and dark corridors, the perfect place for an ambush. Victor led the way, his every movement calculated, his eyes scanning their surroundings with the practiced precision of someone who had been in dangerous situations before. As they ventured deeper into the factory, Lena's anxiety grew. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the distant creaks of the old building settling. But they pressed on, determined to find the list before their enemies did. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed through the factory, a metallic clang, followed by hurried footsteps. Lena's heart leapt into her throat as she realized they weren't alone. Victor's hand shot up in a silent signal for them to stop, his eyes narrowing as he listened. We're not alone, he whispered, confirming Lena's fears. Get ready. Before they could react, the factory erupted into chaos. Figures emerged from the shadows, guns drawn, and the air was filled with the deafening sound of gunfire. Victor's team moved swiftly, returning fire as they sought cover behind the rusted machinery. Lena dropped to the ground, her heart racing as bullets whizzed past her. Stay down, Victor shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. Lena obeyed, crawling to a safer spot behind an old conveyor belt. The fight was intense, the factory filled with the flashes of muzzle fire and the shouts of men locked in combat. Lena felt a surge of panic. This wasn't just a search for a list. It was a battle for survival. Amidst the chaos, Lena's eyes locked onto a figure moving quickly through the shadows, a man clutching a small, weathered briefcase. Her instinct screamed at her that this was what they were looking for. Without thinking, she bolted from her cover, chasing after him. "Lena?" Victor's voice rang out, but she didn't stop. She raced through the factory, her feet pounding against the cold concrete, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The man ahead of her glanced back, realizing he was being pursued, and quickened his pace. Lena pushed herself harder, her determination fueled by the knowledge that this briefcase could hold the key to everything. She followed him through a maze of corridors, the sounds of the battle growing distant behind her. The man darted into a small side room, and Lena knew this was her chance. She slammed into the room after him, her momentum carrying her forward as she tackled him to the ground. The briefcase skidded across the floor, coming to rest a few feet away. The man struggled beneath her, but Lena held on, her strength driven by desperation. Finally, with a grunt, she managed to knock the man unconscious, his body going limp beneath her. Panting, Lena scrambled to her feet and grabbed the briefcase. Her hands trembled as she unlatched it, throwing it open to reveal a stack of documents. Her eyes scanned the pages, and her breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was holding: the list. It was real. The names, the connections, the evidence, it was all there. But before she could fully process what she had found, a shadow loomed over her. Lena looked up just in time to see another figure standing in the doorway, a gun aimed directly at her. Her heart froze. She had been so focused on the briefcase that she hadn't heard anyone else approach. "Put it down," the man ordered, his voice cold and unyielding. Lena's mind raced. She was out of options, out of time, but she knew she couldn't let them take the list. Not after everything they had been through. She slowly lowered the briefcase, her eyes locked on the man's. But just as he was about to pull the trigger, there was a sudden burst of gunfire from behind him. The man staggered, his grip on the gun loosening as he crumpled to the ground. Victor stood in the doorway, his gun still smoking. "Are you okay?" he asked urgently, rushing to her side. Lena nodded, her hands still shaking as she clutched the briefcase. "I've got it," she said, her voice breathless. "The list, it's here." Victor's eyes widened as he took in the sight of the documents. "We need to get out of here now." Together, they fled the room, the sounds of battle still echoing through the factory. But Lena knew they had won a crucial victory. The list was in their hands, and with it, the power to bring down the people who had tried to destroy them. But the danger was far from over. As they made their way back to the exit, Lena knew that this was only the beginning of the end. They had the evidence they needed, but now they had to survive long enough to use it. The shadows that had haunted them were closing in, but for the first time, Lena felt a glimmer of hope. They had the truth, and with it, the power to fight back. Lena and Victor's hearts raced as they fled the factory, clutching the briefcase that held the crucial list. Back at the mansion, they quickly planned their next move, knowing they were still being hunted. Victor contacted a trusted journalist, arranging a secret meeting that night to expose the truth. At the safe house, the journalist, a seasoned professional named David, reviewed the documents. "This will bring them down," he said, his voice filled with determination. Victor and Lena knew they had to trust him to get the story out. As the story broke, headlines blazed across the media, exposing the conspiracy. The powerful figures on the list scrambled, but it was too late. The truth was out. David's work ensured the story reached every corner of the nation, and soon, justice would follow. Back at the mansion, Lena and Victor watched the sunrise, knowing they had won a significant battle. The shadows that had loomed over them for so long were finally beginning to lift. They were no longer running. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. The future was uncertain, but together, they were ready for whatever came next. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story about overcoming challenges and family love, don't forget to like the video, comment on what touched you the most, and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for our next exciting story.